Hello, welcome to the next in our series of videos on demystifying IFRS 9's impairment requirements. I'm Sandra Thompson. I lead our global IFRS technical accounting group for financial instruments, and I'm very pleased to be here today with Mark Randall. Mark, I'm sure you've seen before in our previous videos, who leads our IFRS work in the UK with our UK banks. What we're going to do today is to give you a flavour from what we've seen some of our early experiences with applying IFRS 9. This is based on some work we've done looking at 25 banks across Europe, which includes the 6 UK banks that have issued transition documents that are more extensive than what's generally been done elsewhere. Now, I should say this is not a systematic benchmarking or fulsome exercise, but hopefully we'll give you some good insights and some good flavours as to what banks have done and what we think is good disclosure, and indeed how you might communicate well with analysts and other stakeholders to communicate the story. The other thing I should say up front is this is very early experiences, and we do expect the disclosures to continue to evolve as the year progresses. So before we get into impairment, I'm going to touch on a few other issues. So generally the impact of adopting IFRS 9's classification and measurement requirements has been smaller than that for impairment. However, it's not always the case, and it very much varies from one bank to another. Just to give you a flavour of where the changes have been, a number of banks have taken the opportunity to look again at their fair value options, and that's prompted some changes. And then there are a number of assets that fail the SPPI test. These would include things like junior tranches in securitisations. It would also include bonds or loans that are subject to bail-in provisions, and some which have particular repricing or prepayment features. The next thing to note is that few banks have adopted IFRS 9's hedge accounting requirements. Of the 25 banks we looked at, only 2 have moved to IFRS 9 hedge accounting, and the others have all remained on IAS 39. As regards comparative, no banks has restated comparatives, perhaps no surprises there. And then the transition impact. So all banks have disclosed the transition impact, but it really is quite variable. So looking at core equity tier 1 on a fully loaded basis, the impact varies from minus 30 basis points up to plus 100 basis points. Narrowing it down to the impairment and then the impact on the impairment provision, the changes from minus 1% up to a positive change of 53%, so a 53% increase in the provision. Now, this can be for very good reasons. Banks have different books, different products, but I think it does highlight that it's very important that banks explain to analysts why the changes are what they are. They very much tell their own story and give a flavour for why not one bank doesn't look like another. Okay, so Mark, if we move on to impairment, can you give us a flavour of what we've seen, particularly around the staging?
Sure, Sandra. So I think it's fair to say that all the banks we looked at had quantitative, qualitative and backstop criteria, so 30 days past due, within their staging criteria, and we didn't see any bank who rebutted the 30 days past due presumption. And in terms of the qualitative assessment, I think there were consistent themes around looking at factors such as forbearance or kind of payment holidays for distressed customers and heightened monitoring such as watch lists. In terms of the definition of default, we've seen a few banks that have rebutted the 90 days past due presumption there. But I think there's one example I saw where a bank gave very good disclosures explaining what the net impact was arising from using a 180 days definition rather than 90. And I think that's a good takeaway. If there's something you're doing, very few other banks will do, and might raise questions, be on the front foot, provide disclosure around that. And then moving away more from the criteria and kind of some of the numerical disclosures that we've seen, I think it's quite common that banks are providing coverage ratios for stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. So the ECL, the gross amount, and the ratio there. And that's a metric that was commonly used under 39, and I'm sure analysts will continue to use. And then one of the other features I've heard analysts commenting that they did actually really like was being even more granular within stage 2 and subdividing between those that are in stage 2 because they are 30 days past due, those that are 1 to 29 days past due, and those that are no days past due. And the reason for that is I think it allows users of the accounts to understand what proportion are going to stage 2 only because of the backstop, and gives you some sense of how well the staging criteria are performing and what is a little bit past due and might in due course become 30 days past due. So that's what we're seeing around staging. Sandra, I guess the other big beast that people are very much focused on is multiple scenarios. Do you want to share what we're seeing around that?
Yeah, very much. As you say, this is one of the key issues with IFRS 9. I think the single biggest question we get is how many scenarios? I think we're generally seeing 3 to 5. 3 is probably the most common number. Certainly a number of banks are using 4, so an additional downside, or 5 with one additional upside and downside, or indeed 2 additional downsides. We have come across one bank using 50 and doing a kind of form of Monte Carlo simulation, but that seems to be the one bank at the moment. I think one of the key questions is how do you best capture the downside? Now, as I've already flagged up, that can be by putting in additional downside scenarios rather than just having one. In some cases, we've seen banks add an overlay. Now, that may be an overlay for a particular issue. So, for example, for Brexit in the UK, if there's a nasty downside Brexit scenario, or a more general overlay to capture non-linearities that are not in the main model. Which brings me neatly onto the subject of overlays, and indeed a number of banks are disclosing they are using overlays. In addition to non-linearities, other reasons quoted are data gaps or timing mismatches. So if you're running your model, say, a month ahead of the reporting date and then doing an overlay for any big changes in that intervening months. The next area that merits disclosure is what economic inputs are going into your multiple scenarios. Now, many banks are disclosing their key economic inputs, things like GDP or house price indices or inflation or unemployment. The typical number disclosed is 4, we have seen up to 9. And then the important point here again is reflecting what's important to you. So if you have commodity exposure, for example, that may be a key economic metric to be disclosing, whereas if you don't have material commodity exposure, it won't be. In terms of how to disclose those variables and how they morph over time, we've seen some quite good thought process going into that. In particular, a couple of banks have given graphs, and I think it goes back to a picture is worth 1,000 words. The graphs can be a very effective way of showing how economic variables are forecast to evolve over time. And the other point here is not only thinking about how you're going to disclose in the first period, but of course over time, both the weightings and the multiple scenarios themselves, each scenario will change and the inputs into those scenarios will change. So how are you going to be able to disclose those changes? And again, I think graphs can be a very effective way to do that. So that covers off 2 key areas in the standard. Mark, can you give us a flavour of some other themes and interesting disclosures we've seen?
Sure. So I guess one of the key areas of focus, certainly in year 1, is going to be what was the adoption impact, and more importantly, what were the reasons for that. Now, many banks are splitting that up between the impacts arising from reclassification, so some of the examples you gave earlier, and then remeasurement, in particular with the new impairment requirements. But a number of the banks have taken it a step further and done a waterfall diagram, breaking up the moving parts into things like stage 2 loans which had no impairment coverage under IAS 39, off-balance sheet loan commitments which previously had, again, no impairment coverage but do under IFRS 9. And then another example we're seeing a number of cases is the impact of multiple economic scenarios on the stage 3 or already impaired portfolios, where I think some users might expect that there's no change there, and that's important, the message that there can be because of the incorporation of multiple stages. So I think going back to your picture being 1,000 words, I think that those types of diagrams are very helpful. And if they're not in the financial statements, they're the sorts of thing you might expect to see in investor presentations. I think the question therefore would be, well, why not put that in the financial statements and share that insight more broadly? So I think that's the first area I would talk about. The second area is around the lives of credit cards and revolving credit facilities, where there's been lots of technical discussion in the market around that. In terms of the disclosures we're seeing, the good ones are clarifying the lives that are being used. Is that behavioural life? If that is, what does that actually translate to? We're seeing maybe up to 6 years, up to 10 years in one instance. And again, there's one bank I saw who capped the life at 3 years, but what they gave was really good disclosure explaining what impact there would have been had they not had that cap and if the life had been 10 plus years. And I think, again, that's a good example just to put things in context and answer questions that people might be otherwise asking. The last thing I would pick up that is pretty common in the disclosures is around whether banks are taking advantage of the regulatory capital relief that's there. I think it's kind of from those that disclosing is maybe 50-50 between those that do and those that don't, but I think the key is just being clear so that analysts do understand, and there might not be any surprise if an analyst thinks the transition relief is being taken and it isn't, or vice versa. And then the last thing I would just mention more as a point forward, and something that hasn't been disclosed yet, or that we haven't seen yet, is disclosures around sensitivities to potential changes to things like future macroeconomics. Again, there's lots of debate about that. That's going to carry on, I'm sure, but I think that's very much one to watch and a key area of focus for year-end reporting.
Many thanks, Mark. I think that's given us some very useful insights. So just to recap, hopefully you found this useful, just to give you a high-level overview of some of the common things we've seen so far. I think my closing message would be, do plan ahead as you go into adopting IFRS 9. Think ahead about who you need to involve in the kind of disclosures you're going to give. That will be a whole range, I suspect, of internal stakeholders, not just finance, but probably investor relations, probably a disclosure or audit committee, as well as, of course, your auditors who may need to sign off on these disclosures. And plan your design carefully. One thing we've touched on a couple of times is a picture can be worth 1,000 words. And also the need not just to focus on what you give first time, but think about how things might change in upcoming periods as, for example, multiple scenarios change or economic conditions deteriorate, and how you can set your disclosure up in such a way that it kind of stands the test of time and continues to communicate well. And I guess my final takeaway is reiterating Mark's message about sensitivities. We've yet to see that, probably not surprising at this early stage, but I think there is a push towards more disclosures around sensitivities, and some early thought into that would be well advised. Thank you very much for listening.